Morning, and thank you for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 2 meeting related to the transmission, commitment, and congestion rent allocation. My name is Elisandra Casillas from the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be providing support for the meeting. Deb Levine is the facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes is the scribe, along with Phil Pettingale, who is listed as a panelist, is the coordinator overseeing all three of the active EDAM working groups. The meetings for this working group are held weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Participation details for each of the meetings are available on the ISO's public calendar. Next slide, please. Some meeting reminders. These working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we encourage participants to share ideas and perspectives during these meetings. If at any time you have a question, please raise your hand and the facilitator will call on you. And as a reminder, please remember to state your name and affiliation first, as the rest of the group knows who's speaking. The working group meetings are recorded and video files are posted on corresponding working group web pages. Please request permission from the ISO before reprinting these transcriptions. Stakeholders are welcome to present their perspectives at these meetings. If so, please submit a request to present using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. The materials related to the Working Group 2 meetings are posted on the associated web page, which is also linked on the resources slide, along with other links to help you engage in the EDAM stakeholder process. Next slide, please. For today's agenda, after my welcome and introduction, I will turn the meeting over to Deb Levine to kick off today's meeting, and where she'll proceed with the continuation of the Working Group 2 status check, then close with upcoming topics. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deb Levine.
What I'm going to do today is we were able to include in the presentation the diagrams that people had asked for the existing contract and how it would actually work. So we'll start there and then go forward in the presentation. But I'd also like to note that for those of you that didn't see it, we did post some questions on Thursday. People had asked for the ability to respond to questions in written form. And we went ahead and did post some questions on Thursday. Those questions are due on the 14th of March, which is almost a week, a little over a week from, a little less than a week from now, because the last of our meetings is set up for the 17th. So at this point in time, we'll have to see. What we'll do is with the questions is we'll go ahead and definitely take them under consideration for the straw proposal issue paper that's going to be coming out. It's just a question as to how many comments come in, how in-depth the comments are, et cetera, as to what we'll be able to handle in the working group meetings. So with that, what I'd like to do is go ahead and turn it over to George Angelides to go through this example of transmission contract definition and how it would work and be settled for transfers. And then James Lynn is going to go through a example of internal transmission and how that works as far as serving load is concerned from internal generation, along with the contract reference numbers and the settlements of that. So with that introduction, George, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning. This is George Angelides with the ISO. I'll walk through a few slides to describe how a transmission contract can be defined and exercised in EDAM. And this is an example that shows a transmission contract that basically ties a generator in BAA 1 through a bucket 1 transfer to a load in BAA 2. So what we expect to happen is that the EDAM entity for BAA 1 or BAA 2, one of them, will register in the master file the specifics for the contract, or if the master file lead time of 7 days is insufficient for this contract registration, then they can also provide this information in cyber It's the same information that needs to be provided, and we expect that this will take place before 9 a.m. of the day that this contract can be exercised, so that we can take and consider it, particularly because of its bucket one transfer in the resource efficiency evaluation, the advisory one that will run at 9 a.m. So the elements that need to be registered or declared in Cyber is the unique contract reference number, that's CRN, that identifies the contract and all its parts. The source for the contract, which is in this example that generator, and how much capacity out of that generator is associated with the contract, in this example 100 megawatts. The load on the other side, that is part of the contract, and how much capacity for that load is also associated with the contract, in this example 100 megawatts. Specifically for load, the load resource is usually a load aggregation point, either a default load aggregation point for the entire BAA2 or a custom load aggregation that specifies a specific area in BA2, then that has to be predefined in the master file. It cannot be declared in Cyber. The load resource has to exist. And of course, the bucket one transfer, that is part of the contract path, and this is defined as a pair of energy transfer system resources. We call them ETSRs. So there is a pair of them, one for the export from BAA1 and one for the import into BAA2. These are mirroring each other. They have the same schedule always, and they need to be predefined in the master file, but the declaration association with the contract reference number can happen in Cyber. And there has to be a declaration for the scheduling limit, how much is associated with the contract on this bucket one transfer. In this example, 100 megawatts. This can be also specified by 9 a.m. So this is the information that we need, and this is what the EDAM entity will provide, either through master file registration or through the Cyber. We can move to the next slide and see how this can be exercised now in the EDAM once it has been defined. So we assume here that the scheduling coordinator for the generator, I call that SC1, it will self-schedule 100 megawatts under the contract reference number. So that's a special self-schedule, a high priority self-schedule associated with the CRN. And that is specifically associated with the contract, but the generator could have additional capacity that can be made available to the market, either through other self-schedules and additional bid. So that is a total participation of the generator, but 100 megawatts of the special self-schedule is associated with the contract reference number and will receive a higher scheduling priority. The same thing happens on the load. The load can be self-scheduled, I assume here by another scheduling coordinator, SC2, for 100 megawatts associated with the CRN again. So that's also a special self-schedule, has higher scheduling priority. And of course, there could be additional self-schedule and bid for that load outside of the contract that can participate in the market. And then we have scheduling coordinator 3 that will self-schedule now the ETSRs for the transfer. So it will self-schedule ETSR 1, which is the export from BAA1, and ETSR 2, which is the import into BAA2. They have to have exactly the same self-schedule because these are mirroring each other. And in this case, that is a 100 megawatt self-schedule under the CRN. Again, this is a special high priority self-schedule. And the only case that we allow a scheduling coordinator to self-schedule an ETSR. Normally, ETSRs being part of transfers, they're dynamically scheduled by the market optimally. So this is the only scenario that we will allow a scheduling coordinator to self-schedule a transfer. And this is because it is specifically associated with the contract reference number. Okay. Now, although I'm using a general scenario here where SC1, SC2, and SC3 could be different scheduling coordinators, they could all be the same one as well. So our system and what we propose here, they can support different SCs exercising the same contract at different components. So once this is exercised, it's good to have it by 9 a.m., of course, because then we will use that bucket 1 transfer in the resource efficiency evaluation to essentially transfer 100 megawatts of demand forecast from BA2 to BA1. That's the effect of the bucket 1 transfer. Let's go into the next slide and see the settlement for this specific contract, the way it's scheduled. So as I mentioned, all these self-schedules for the generator, the ETSRs, and the load that are associated with the CRN, they have high scheduling priorities, so we expect them to clear the day-ahead market. And then let's assume that the LMPs are $20 for the marginal energy cost in BA1 and $30 in BA2. The marginal energy cost is the SATA price of the power balance constraint of the BAA. So there's a price differential here between the BAAs across the transfer, which is $10, and for 100 megawatts, which is the transfer that will be clearing the market, we have a transfer revenue of $1,000 on that particular transfer. Let's assume further that the LMP at the generator is $15. So there's a $5 congestion and marginal loss from the marginal energy cost of $20 in that BAA. And at the load is $35. So again, we assume there's a $5 marginal loss and congestion that gets to the LMP 35 from the marginal energy cost of $30 in the BAA. Let's see how the settlement will play out. So SC1 is paid for the 100 megawatt generation at G, and this is a specific settlement for the contract. There could be other other schedule from that generator that's also paid for its generation, but we don't look at it in this example. We focus on the contract. So that's $1,500 that generator G is paid for. SC3, if you remember, it's exporting at the ETSR1. So the export is charged the marginal energy cost, which is $20 for 100 megawatts. So it's charged $2,000 for ETSR1. So we settle here the transfers, okay? And because of this differential, BAA1 collects $500. Let's say it's congestion revenue. Let's forget loss for a moment. Similar things happen with BAA2. SC3 is paid for its import at the ETSR2 at the marginal energy cost of $30, so that's $3,000. And SC2 is charged for the load at the LMP of $35, so it's charged $3,500. So again, here BA2 collects $500 of congestion revenue. Now, here comes the financial right for the contract, all right? We assume that there is a financial right in addition to the physical right for this contract. So what happens here that SC1 was paid $1,500 instead of $2,000, which is the marginal energy cost in BA1 because of $500 congestion. So it receives, as part of its financial right, $500 under the CRN as a refund or a rebate, if you wish, for congestion, and that comes from BA1. SC2, similarly, is paying $3,500, which is $500 more than the $30 marginal energy cost in BA2. That's because of congestion. So it receives, through the financial right, $500 rebate for that congestion charge, and this comes from BA2. And then finally, SC3, who scheduled the transfer, receives the transfer revenue of $1,000. This is already baked into the settlement because, as you see, SC3 was paid $3,000 for the ETSR2 and was charged $2,000 for ETSR1, so it has a net revenue of $1,000, which is the transfer revenue. Now, looking at all this in aggregate, what you see is that BA1 is neutral because it received $500 of congestion revenue from G and ETSR1, but then it paid it back for the financial rights, so they're neutral. Same for BA2, it received $500 congestion revenue from the ETSR2 and L, the load, and it paid it back to the load as because of the financial right. So BA2 is also neutral. And the SC, if you string the contract all the way through now, or you assume that it's the same as C, 1, 2, and 3 is the same as 3, if you look at it, the whole contract is also neutral in aggregate because essentially after you rebate the congestion charges and the transfer revenue that is collected, the energy is really cancels out, the energy charge, and therefore they're completely neutral. And that's the perfect hedge for exercising this contract, meaning that the financial right is really covering the costs of the energy settlement as the contract is settled going through. So let me open up for any questions that may be so that we can make sure that this is all clear, okay?
All right, operator, can you open up the line for Perry Sabrino?
Hey, this is Perry Sabrino, GDS Associates. George, thanks for the example. This is really helpful. It's kind of what I was looking for on Tuesday, so I'm glad you put this together. I just had a couple clarifying questions, one of which is on the previous slide.
Can we have the previous slide, please?
I need to see it so I can remember what the question was. Right. Okay. So you have SC1, 2, and 3. One's representing the generator, one's representing the load. So I can see why you would need two different, potentially two different scheduling coordinators, one scheduling their generator, one scheduling their load. My question is on this third SC scheduling, the ETSR. Is there ever an instance where if the CAISO has a self-schedule on a CRN from a generator and a self-schedule on a load on the same CRN, you know, from a load, is there ever an instance in which the transfer should not also just be assumed self-scheduled? I mean, it's the same CRN, right?
Yeah, that's what we saw here, Perry. We have actually SC3 explicitly self-scheduling the contract so that we make sure that this is going to be scheduled irrespective of economics. If you don't have the self-schedule, the market may schedule something different than 100 megawatts on that transfer, depending on the economics. So we're going to make sure that this 100 megawatt is scheduled, right, because it's a physical contract.
Are you envisioning that's something that a market participant has to schedule, self-schedule in addition to just self-scheduling the gen and the load on the CRN?
Yes, I envision that because we want to string everything together, and we want to also validate that the two things, that the contract is balanced, is exercised in a balanced form, and that it doesn't oversubscribe its entitlement, which is 100 megawatts here. So we need to put the pieces together. So I think it's to facilitate validation and settlement. It will be a lot more complicated if we don't have that middle piece, and then we have to search for it and find it and connect it.
I guess the question was, you know, you had an example where all three of these SCs could be the same entity, right?
Yes.
Yeah, there could be either affiliates or the same entity. I'm just presenting here a general scenario that, you know, there could also be different.
Yeah, it just seemed like one extra step for user error. If the CAISO had a generation scheduled on a CRN and load scheduled on a CRN, and that CRN is defined, it seemed like you could assume the self-schedule on the ETSR between the two locations and not need to have this additional place where things could break down.
The problem is,
the
problem is that we don't know which ETSR. Like there could be hundreds of them literally, different interties, different transfers. I mean, we don't know which one is exercised, so we need the participant to tell us. We need somebody to self-schedule these things so that we know. Otherwise, as I said, if it's not self-scheduled, the right one, the market may schedule something different on it, and then we have a discrepancy, right? This is
so George, Perry, this is similar as we do in ISO today, where you have a contract chain. You need to make sure that all of the chain elements, that they're balanced along that chain. If for some reason the ETSR does not have the available transmission to facilitate this transfer across, then we need to, the whole chain needs to be limited by that ETSR. So just making the assumption that the ETSR there is why we're not doing this.
Oh, I just meant assume the ETSR. I mean, in the simple example, 2 BAs, 1 ETSR, right? So at least there, that's why the thought came up that wouldn't you assume it's that ETSR that would potentially limit this this transfer on this CRN?
Yeah, well, that's why we need them to schedule it, so they tell us exactly how much they're using of that ETSR, so that we can ensure that it's balanced all the way through.
Yeah, Perry, we wouldn't know which ETSR it is if it's more than one there. So, and there could be even, multiple ETSRs associated with a specific contract reference number. There could be multiple paths that the contract path has, and we don't know which transfer to use. We cannot make the assumption. We need this explicit scheduling for us to piece the things together, right?
Sure. I think that kind of brings me to my next point on the next slide, and I'll just start with a question. And just to clarify here, is the transfer congestion does the difference does the congestion between G and L, is that inclusive of the transfer congestion?
Well, if you think about the differential, the price differential from L to G, it has $500 price difference from G to ETSR 1, $1,000 from ETSR 1 to ETSR 2, and another $500 from ETSR 2 to L. So you have three pieces of price differentials. The first and the third are congestion revenue that is normally collected inside the BAA from the energy settlement. And the middle piece, which is on the transfer, it's collected by that SC3, again, by settling the transfers, it represents the transfer revenue from that transfer. So we don't call that congestion revenue because it really materializes the price difference between marginal energy prices, but it's similar in nature, right? It's a price differential.
Sure. I think I had an easier, that all sounded very complicated. Mike, just looking at the simple example that's on the slide, does the $20 in congestion between G and L, is that inclusive of the $10 in congestion between the two BAs? Like,
yes,
the LMP
I broke it down for you, right? It's $5 plus $10 plus $5 if you look at the entire contract from source to sink.
So the answer is yes?
If you settle the generator and the load, you have a difference of $20, which is composed of a $5 congestion in BA1, $10 transfer revenue, and then $5 congestion in BAA2.
Okay, so I'm hearing yes then. you know, when I look at this, if I have a contract with a generator and another BAA that I'm trying to bring into sync to my load in my BAA, I look at this and I say, well, you know, and let's say I want to be held harmless and just continue my current practice like I'm doing today. I would use this tool that you set up here, use the CRNs, and you know, again on the previous slide, I'm not quite sure I need the third party scheduling the ETSR, but I'm essentially representing to the CAISO that I would like to take generation from this single point to my load center. And it may cross this BA, let's say in this example, it crosses this BA boundary. The reason I asked if the difference between the $15 at the generator node and the $35 at the load node is inclusive of the transfer congestion, is because if I had that contract and I've gotten all that transmission, I'd want to be held harmless to this $20 in congestion, right? Between these two nodes. You know, call it what you will, whether it's congestion in one BA or on a transfer path or whatever. To me, all that matters is $20 in congestion that I need to be made whole to. So right. It looks like how I would accomplish that is, and let's say I'm just the SC for the load. Now, I can understand two SCs, one getting, the generator getting paid, load getting paid. But let's say I'm just holding I'm the CRN holder itself on this full, this full path from G to L. It looks like I would get I guess I'm asking, how do I get my $20 back?
Well, we showed you here, Perry. Assume that all this is the same affiliate or it's the same SC, all right? That's how easy it is to see it. So those last sub-bullets there in this slide, they show you what happens when the financial right is exercised. You get the $500 back from BAA1 for the $5 congestion differential in BAA1. You get the $500 back from BAA2 for the $5 differential for congestion in BA2, and you receive the $10 as a net payment for the price differential between BA1 and BA2. That's your transfer revenue on the transfer. If you add this up, you get your $20.
Oh,
right?
So is CAISO going to settle me for the $2,000, and I'm done?
Okay, the settlement is exactly what you see here in this bullet. You have settlement with SC1, settlement with SC3, settlement with SC2. So and the rebates. These are existing charges that we have, charge codes. So you will not get. I don't know what you're getting at. Maybe you think that you will get one convenient single settlement, but it's not. It's all these pieces, right? James, maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, so I think what Perry's trying to get at is, so SC1 is going to get paid ultimately $2,000. SC3 is going to get paid $3,000. And then the transfer, so the transfer customer that provided the ETSR is going to get the $1,000 back or revenue to them, bringing it back to being balance of, I think it's $2,000. Let me make sure. So I gotta get those numbers right. But so ultimately, you're going to get paid at the energy cost, Perry. And,
I was attempting to make it less confusing by just saying I'm the one with the forward contract. I'm the one with, so all these SCs are the same. I need to get $2,000 back. I'm asking who settles me that I paid that $2,000 to CAISO through my day ahead schedules. Who's going to hand me that? Who's going to settle me that $2,000 back? Do I have to go to?
So you're going to, the generator's going to get paid $2,000.
I'm just talking about the congestion, guys. That there's $2,000 of congestion, and I thought it was an easy question. I'm just asking who will settle me my $2,000 back.
Right. So we're trying to answer it. So SC1 is going to get the $500 back from BA1 because each BAA has to be neutral from a day-ahead settlement perspective. So at this point, when I refund the $500 to SCE1 for their congestion, it is going to be coming from this $500 that we originally collected in the LMP settlement for BA1. For SCE2, you're going to get $500 from the congestion rents, in essence, from BA2. You're going to get paid back the $500, and it reduces the congestion rents in BA2. For the transfer, we are going to take the energy price differences across that transfer, and we're going to give that revenue back to the SCE3, which is you, in essence, for the collection of that congestion, of that transfer revenue. You paid it, and we're paying you back.
Got it. I think I got it. It's just one clarifying thing. So you've been saying is CAISO cutting you back to $2,000? Is CAISO settlements cutting you the check for the $2,000 in congestion difference?
The ISO settlement system will do this true-up mechanism, and so when you receive your invoice, you won't see the $500 being charged out and collected at different times. It's all going to be in the same invoice. So you'll be revenue neutral for the congestion on that trade date.
Directly from the CAISO. I don't have to work with anyone else, right?
It'll come through the ISO settlement system, correct.
Okay, that was my question.
That is the proposal now, the way this is set up.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good proposal because it would seem like a roundabout way for me to need to collect all of my congestion from a bunch of different entities when I paid that congestion to just the CAISO. So I think you're on the right track there. If CAISO is going to settle me, in essence, settle me the $2,000 in congestion if I'm just trying to be held harmless to my existing practice. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Barry.
Thank you, Barry. Operator, can you open up the line for Doug Boccignoni, please?
Doug Boccignoni for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I have a few questions. Can you describe how ETSR1 and ETSR2 are created or obtained? And I'm thinking for like a concrete example, if a party, let's say BPA's in the EDAM, and a party has point-to-point rights across the BPA system to the California border, does that party have the ETSR1 and somebody else has ECR2, or does that party also have both parts of the ETSR?
Yeah, Doug. So these are defined in the master file at the same time. So what happens is during the onboarding process, and I'm referring to the current EIM onboarding process, it will be similar for EDAM. When BAA joins the market, in this case EDAM, they will let us know, the EDAM entity will let us know what transmission capacity will be released with other BAAs, and the BAAs that are involved, they will agree to specify to the market operator what transfer will be registered, and in the master file we set up the ETSRs for each transfer. So in this particular case, the EDAM entities of BA1 and BA2 are aware of this contractual arrangement, and they want to facilitate their customers for exercising this contract. So they will come to the market operator and they will say, we have a contract that we want to register a bucket one transfer for it, and they will give us the intertie and the scheduling limit, how much is this contract good for, and we'll register in the master file this pair of ETSRs, and we'll put a maximum scheduling limit for 100 megawatts because it could be exercised less than that in any given hour of the market. And once this is set up, we also need to know now the specific association of source and sinks with that contract, and that's the other part where the generator G is associated with it, and the load L is associated with it. But as far as the transfer goes, and this is true for every transfer, not specifically this packet 1 transfer, we set it up front based on the information that we receive from the EDAM entities. Okay?
But so in the example I gave with, rights across the BPA system, that gets you to the California-Oregon border, doesn't get you across the intertie. So in essence, like today, a party can sell at the intertie and then to to CAISO, to anybody in CAISO. So would this, if what you described, it suggests that if they have a contract with a load in CAISO, that's how the two pieces of the ETSR get created.
Yeah, so in this particular scenario with the ISO BAA, let's say this is an array contract perhaps. That's what comes to mind here. So BPA being part of EDAM will say to facilitate our customer who has this array contract and they need to schedule it with the ISO. Now, array contract doesn't have all these higher scheduling priorities, but let's go with it for a moment. And let's say we want to set up this bucket 1 transfer, import transfer to the ISO so that this customer can schedule its array contract. And then as we have said, I think in this work group, that we were also proposing a reciprocity mechanism where the ISO balancing authority area will release an equal amount of transmission as bucket 2 transmission in the export direction as reciprocity for that bucket 1. But specifically for this contract, now, yes, the BPA will say, please register ETSRs for this contract for good for 100 megawatts. So we're going to go in the master file. We'll say which intertie, let's say Malin, we'll set up those ETSRs on each side of the Malin intertie. We'll associate them with this contract reference number. And that's one piece of the puzzle. And then the other piece is associating the source, whatever is the array generator in BPA, and where is it going from? If it is PG&E load or whatever RU load is the other side, also has to be associated with the contract, and then we have the full path laid out.
Yes, so what you just described to me, it sounds like the ETSR2 sort of held by the ISO, that BAA2 entity, whoever that is, that counterparty, and then the BAA1 ETSR is held by that BAA's party. Does that make sense?
Well, they go together, right? It's a pair of mirroring resources, so they're registered together. Now, as far as settlement goes, yes, it's BAA1 that has the settlement in terms of its neutrality with the ETSR1, and BA2 the settlement with ETSR2, all right, because it's an input to BA2. But if you're asking who owns them, we assume here that scheduling coordinator 3, which is the designated scheduling coordinator that's going to exercise that part of the contract path associated with the contract, is the one that is registered for ETSR1 and ETSR2 so that they can self-schedule on them, right? So we always have an association of an SC to a resource for scheduling purposes.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of just one thing that strikes me is with the self-scheduling requirement, one thing we're potentially missing out on is sort of the economic bidding of the generation and the load, or today what happens is people bid at the intertie. That would sort of go away. And I'm just wondering, like, the alternative to this is the transmission is contributed, let's say. I think we're now talking more like bucket 2. But in that scenario, in exchange for contributing the transmission, the party are getting the ETSR value in some fashion. But then you would, if you went that route, the generation would bid economically, the load would bid economically, and then the transfer would just happen automatically. And I'm wondering if the settlements impacts would be the same as what you just described here, except that you would have the advantage or the benefit of the economic bidding rather than the self-scheduling.
Okay. Well, let's make sure what exactly is the question so that I can give you the proper answer. I think you're asking, what if this was not a contract? What if this was a bucket 1, bucket 2, or bucket 3 transfer that was economically optimized in the market? What would the settlement be? Is that your question?
Yeah, and can it work out so that you basically get the same result, but
no, you won't get the same result. You will not get the same result because if this is not a contractual transfer, if it's any of these bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3 transfers that are optimized in the market, the transfer revenue for that is distributed based on what we have discussed in previous calls. All right, bucket 1 and bucket 2, it's, let's say these are EDAM BAAs both, so the transfer revenue is split evenly between BAA1 and BAA2. Okay, no specific scheduling coordinator will receive that because there's no contract associated with that. It's free for all. And if it's bucket 3 and it's used, that specific transmission customer or transmission service provider that's associated with those ETSRs for that bucket 3 receives its transmission fee. And if the price differential exceeds the transmission fee, the balance of the transfer revenue, again, it's split 50-50. So we have seen these examples. You remember the spreadsheet we went through some calls ago. So that's different from what we're talking here. This is a specific example for a contract exercise where the transfer revenue goes to whoever is associated with the contract. This is C3. Otherwise, the transfer revenue has a different distribution. So you have a different outcome. And here, the schedule on that bucket 1 transfer associated with the contract will be 100 megawatts because it's self-scheduled. If it's another transfer that is not contractual and it's scheduled optimally, the schedule could be anywhere between 0 and 100. So you have a different outcome, right?
Yeah, and I guess the thing that worries me is if you have that, because of the potential for the different outcome, there's going to be different incentives for the holders of the rights to decide whether they want to get the benefit of their rights by self-scheduling, or their alternative is to contribute the rights and get transfer revenues. And if you have different outcomes from the two things, it's going to have an impact on what people choose to do, obviously. And
yes, there is a slide that shows the options for exercising the contract, and I believe Debbie's going to go through it. We've seen it before. I presented it before. You have different options when you have a contract on how if you decide to exercise it, or if you decide to schedule economically on it, or even withhold it for real time. So you have all these options, and you're right. Whoever has a contract, they have the ability to exercise the contract the day ahead or in real time, or they can schedule economically. It's up to them, and they will have to decide what's best for them. So every time that you leave it open, free for all, it's optimized and it's used in an optimal way to increase efficiency. When you self-schedule on it, now you essentially overwrite the optimal solution and say, no, I want to use this for myself. That may not be optimal, but it's your right. You're welcome to use it if you want to. And I think this is the slide that we're talking about. Maybe Debbie, you can go through this. I don't know if we have more questions or maybe Doug, you can hold your questions until we go through the slide, because this is exactly
sure. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
I don't know, Debbie, do we have any more questions, or are you going to go with this one? Oh, we can't hear you, Debbie. I think you're muted.
Sorry, yes, we have more questions. But Doug, in essence, this is the previous slide from the example slide. And as George was just stating, you can either exercise your rights or not exercise your rights and economically bid. It's up to you what you want to do. So that's going to be a choice that each entity that has transmission contracts is going to have to make on their own. Operator, can you open the line for Chris Devon, please?
Hi there, this is Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes, we can. Thanks.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks, for the examples and stuff. I just was curious, like in this example where it says it's revenue neutral, I'm just curious if there's a potential that if the prices in the different EDAM BA don't, result in enough revenue from the transfers to cover the cost of this, quote unquote rebate for the congestion from the self-scheduling or exercising of the contracts, then is there potential for that to even happen in these kind of, in that example? I think it was on slide 14 or whatever one we were on, I forget.
I think it's Operator, if you could go to slide 15.
15, sorry. So I see how in this example it says it's BA 1 and 2 are neutral, and that it's a perfect hedge, but I'm just wondering if this would actually ever occur where, perhaps the different marginal energy costs ends up with the transfer revenue that doesn't actually, cover the congestion rebate piece of it. But I'm trying to think through it in my head, so I'll just stop and let George explain to me. Maybe the calculation, just the congestion would never actually increase enough based on these other prices, but I'm just not quite following that aspect of this example. So any help on that would be helpful. And, if there is a potential for, these to be some leftover, money needed to be uplifted or something, then I think there was some discussion of that previously with like Brookfield. I think, Steve Greenleaf had asked about it, but I didn't quite follow the response in the prior discussion. So that was kind of what I was wondering about.
Yeah. Okay. So, Chris, the rebate for the financial right is really the same as what is charged through the energy settlement. The only difference might be in the rights that the contract has. For example, there may be some contracts have a financial right to only to the congestion difference, not the losses. Others, they also include loss differentials as part of the financial right. So it depends on the specific contract. If the loss differential is not included, obviously what you're going to get back for the financial right is only the congestion difference, and you're still out for the loss difference. So you don't have the perfect hedge because of that. But this is just because of what how the rights are stipulated in the contract. The other case that I may think of is if you have a D-rate, but it's difficult for the day-ahead market to imagine that if there was a D-rate and we knew about it by 9 a.m., the EDAM entity would not have specified 100 megawatts, the scheduling limit. So only if the scheduling limit is not 100, it's reduced because of a D-rate, maybe the contract cannot be exercised at 100 megawatts. So now you have less transfer revenue on the middle piece because it's only, let's say, 80 megawatts or 60 or whatever. Then obviously you have a differential. You're not collecting enough transfer revenue to cover the settlement cost. But these are odd examples. We don't expect in normal cases any neutrality in terms of the contract per se. It should be neutral.
Perfectly. Right.
So
okay.
George?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I just want to add something to it. So for this contract path, the contribution to the congestion rent is going to be neutral. When you start looking at all of the other generation and load within the BAAs, it may look like you have to do an uplift, but from the contract path itself, your contribution to the congestion rent is neutral. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm following you. I think so. Basically, in these calculations, the component that you would be refunding would just be based on that part of the overall transfer impact to the actual outcome. So I definitely follow that part now. But I also hear what you're saying, that there could be other potential consequences that maybe might cause some additional uplift. And I guess so. Two things on that. Just one, I'm curious about is what's the plan for it, when that comes up? Is that just going to be general uplift that plan to go to all the BAs that are participating in that transfer that are impacted, or is there a proposal on that yet, or is that still to be determined?
So the transfer revenue this goes back to the examples that I provided several weeks ago. So we will be calculating transfer revenue, and we will be allocating it out to the appropriate transmission provider. What you're referring to is what?
Under those scenarios, A, B, C, that you had talked about, and so we're still kind of thinking about there's options on the table?
Yep, that one.
Got it. Okay, I remember that now. I'll go back and review those. And then last thing would just be moving from the day-ahead time frame, because this seems to make sense to me better now. I understand how it's more neutral than I thought it might possibly be in the day-ahead EDAM context. But then when you move from day-ahead into real-time, I think we're still having to discuss potentially if people exercise these other, third-party rights or something after the EDAM run, and maybe that's another discussion at some point down the road. But if that happens, then I think there could be a situation where there's a need for some kind of uplift or redispatch costs. I'm not necessarily sure if I follow where we were on those discussions. Is the group still going to talk more about potentially how to address that, or is that something that you have a proposal on already?
Well, there is, and I'm going to refer to Milos, who's has some additional slides that talk a little bit more in detail on this.
Okay, we can wait. That's fine. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Operator, can you open up the line for Tong Wu, please?
Hi, this is Tong Wu from WAPA. I have some questions about the mechanisms or the setup of the example or assumptions behind the example. Also, I have some questions about the definition of MEC. So first, let me ask questions about the examples. Can we go to the previous slide with the example? Yeah. Yeah, the previous one with the picture. Yeah, good. Thanks. This is kind of a very generic example. Let me give you a more concrete example so then I can better understand what we're talking about. Let's assume that WAPA has transmission rights on PECI. We do have that, but we don't use it that way. So that's why I say let's assume I have transmission rights on PECI. And I have a load in the ISO. So I will be the scheduling coordinator for schedules on PECI. And also I'll be the scheduling coordinator for the load in the ISO. And I'm not sharing my transmission rights with anybody. It's just my rights. Okay. And let's say BAA2 is California ISO. And my load is in ISO, not in BPA. The rights is mine. It's not anybody in the BPA. So now I have a Schedule C purchase from somebody in the Northwest, not necessarily in the BPA, and I don't know where the generator is. Okay, but I want to use that Schedule C to meet my resource sufficiency evaluation. So then let's assume I'm gonna tell the ISO, I have Schedule C, I have some import that comes from Northwest, and that will use my Pecky rights. Pecky rights is from Malin to Round Mountain. Malin is a point outside of ISO, and Round Mountain is a point inside the ISO. Okay, and I bring my transmission to the ISO. I say, okay, here's my transmission, and here's my import. I want to use this to meet my RSE, to pass my RSE test. So in this situation, I don't know first of all, I don't know the generator. And also, I'm the one who would schedule both sides of the ETSR, I assume. And so in this case, how would this work? First of all, I don't have generation, and also I would schedule ETSR1, ETSR2. I have nothing to do with anybody in the BPA in BAA1. How would this work?
George, you're on double mute.
And yes, I was. Thank you, Debbie. Okay, so first of all, let's have two different scenarios here because it's a little different. So your objective is to make use of this contract that you have, this transmission contract, for resource efficiency evaluation purposes. So let's say you show your WSPPC schedule to BPA. BPA is an EDAM in the scenario, and BPA will release transmission capacity equal to your right on Malin as a bucket 1 transfer. We'll register those ETSRs 1 and 2 for this specific transfer, bucket 1 transfer for 100 megawatts, let's say. And that is all that needs to be done for this to be taken into account in the resource efficiency evaluation. You don't have to schedule it at this point. It could be optimally scheduled in IFM later on, but for resource efficiency evaluation, that bucket 1 transfer essentially will transfer 100 megawatts of demand forecast from the ISO being BAA2 to BPA being BAA1 to perform the resource efficiency evaluation. Now, the resource efficiency evaluation is at the BAA level. So it's not for any specific LSC or for specifically your load. You understand that, right? But the ISO BAA will take a benefit because of this transmission that is released as bucket 1 transfer, your rights essentially, will take a benefit which will also reflect in the entire load for the ISO, including yours. Now, that's only for the RSC. If you're also interested in exercising the scheduling priority for this contract.
So George, before we go to the next scenario, the scheduling, I have some questions about the RSC still. So earlier you mentioned that BPA would open up the transmission rights at the Malin, but this right has nothing to do with the BPA. It's the BA or anybody inside BPA. This is solely WAPA's rights.
Okay. So I mentioned BPA because we would like the EDAM entity to register this. Because they know the contracts and everything, but other than that, we'll have to have the transmission customer, you in this case, WAPA, to register this with the master file. So you'll have to show us the WSCC schedule and say, I have some energy coming, I don't know where, but it's going to come through my lane. I have rights. They're not BPA rights. They're our rights. And I want you to schedule a bucket 1, I want you to define a bucket 1 transfer so that we can get, we mean the entire ISO, the benefit of this transfer for resource efficiency evaluation. But you understand this affects also BPA because they will have an increased demand forecast for that bucket one transfer for their RSC, so they need to be part of this arrangement. They need to be aware of. So that's why I always go through the EDAM entity, because they need to be aware that they will be assuming additional demand forecast in their RSC because of this bucket one transfer. But there is also this reciprocity that I mentioned earlier, that for every megawatt that we get as a bucket one transfer import into the ISO will also release hurdle-free export transfer in the opposite direction. So there are benefits going in either way. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to all work this out amicably, and then you will get the benefit, or all of us in the ISO will get the benefit of this bucket one transfer, reducing our requirements for resource efficiency evaluation, which is one of the elements that you want to achieve.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are some details at this point we have not really figured out yet. So what's exactly the mechanism? How BPA would be aware of that, but BPA doesn't have the rights on this, or they may have rights, but that's not the right we're talking about. We're just talking about the rights that the WAPA has, and only WAPA has for WAPA's portion to schedule WAPA's schedule. And do we need approval or somebody opening up another coordination mechanism, or just like today, we just schedule. That's all we have to do. The PEGI rights is registered with ISO's master file, and we sign, Schedule C schedule. We import it. That's it. We don't need to talk to BPA.
Yeah. Well, I go with what we're doing in EIM today, Tom. When a BAA joins EIM, in the onboarding process, there is always a three-party discussion. The two BAAs that they release transmission, and the market operator that needs to register the transfers for it. So I don't think there is a very prescribed process. There is a process in the onboarding that we go through this. There is exchange of information and discussion. I believe we'll do the same in EDAM. This is an example that will involve both BPA, WAPA, and ISO in coming together to define this bucket one transfer. And although we haven't figured out all the details, I don't think we need to at this point, right?
Okay. All right. And so it sounds like we are talking about the transmission rights across the border. In this example, when I get that Schedule C import, the source may not even be in BPA's BAA, maybe even north, maybe in Washington, maybe in Montana. I don't even know. Okay, so how do I know which generator? So if we tie generator and load and the ETRs all together with the same CRN, then at 9 o'clock, I don't really know the generator. So how do I coordinate that to make sure the generator also do the same?
Okay, so now we're going to the second. Okay, let's stick to the first element first. What do we do for resource efficiency evaluation? So even if the energy is not coming from a BPA generator, BPA wouldn't mind setting up this bucket one transfer, because wherever that generator is, maybe outside BPA, still the energy is going to be scheduled, right? You expect this contract to be good. That wherever that generator is, wherever it is, going to schedule this energy to serve your load, correct? So
yeah, but at 9 o'clock, I may not know the generator.
That's
By
fine.
3 p.m.,
That's
I
fine.
may know, most likely.
Okay, so BPA would assume an additional 100 megawatts, let's say, of demand requirement for the resource efficiency evaluation, but the expectation is also that this generator, wherever it is, they're also going to schedule an import into BPA, let's say from a non-EDAM BAA. You may not know where it's coming from, but unless the market sees it, this is not going to work, all right? The market has to see it. So somebody has to schedule the energy, and if it's not in BPA, it will be scheduled as import into BPA, and that will cover for the additional transfer requirement in the resource efficiency evaluation for BPA is okay. It won't have a problem with that as long as it's scheduled, right? And you don't need to know what it is for resource efficiency evaluation.
Somebody is talking.
Yeah, I just, it says incoming. I was just curious what that means. What are your relative time frames right now?
So by 10, when we run the market, okay, whatever generation is on that WSCC contract, it needs to be scheduled in the market so that the market can see it, right? So if, let's say, if WAPA wants to exercise this right, not knowing which is the generator, they can only exercise the part of the right from the bucket one transfer to the load. And the generator, wherever that generator is going to be, is going to see the full LMP because it's not going to be part of the contract. If it is known in advance that this generator, wherever it is part of the contract and has a CRN association, then they can still schedule using that CRN, and they will get also the financial right as part of the contract, if there is a financial right in that respect. So I think Tom describes that there is a transfer, that there is a right across Malin and to the load. He didn't mention anything from that generator to ETSR1, so I'm not saying that there is a transmission right for that, so it doesn't have to be scheduled to get any financial rights. The financial rights would be limited from ETSR1 to ETSR2 to the load in this example. Tom, you're okay with that?
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm okay. The settlement, what the settlement consequence will be. I'm not that fast. I'm just at this point. I'm just looking at the mechanism.
I'll break it down.
What it requires to make this work.
I'll break it down. So let's say you shall schedule ETSR1, ETSR2, and the load under the CRN, okay? So essentially, you'll be buying the energy for the load at the BAA1 marginal energy cost. In this example, it was $10, I believe. No? Okay. Was it $20? All right. So instead of buying at $35, which is the LMP at the load, with the congestion rebate and the transfer revenue, you'll be buying it at the marginal energy cost of the source in BAA1, which is $20. Okay. So you'll receive the $15 price differential, $10 on the transfer, and $5 for congestion within BAA2. That will be the outcome.
All right.
Okay.
So my understanding, you correct me if I misunderstood, is that it's not a requirement to have a generator in order to exercise the ETSR and the bucket one transfer. Is that right? Generator one is not required at the 9 o'clock.
Yes, in my view, yes. I just want to confirm with James that this is going to work the way we discuss here. Because we will see the schedule. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, as long as I have a reference to the schedule, it could come from an import and it can come from an internal generator. As long as the settlement system has a reference point of that CRN to that resource information or transaction ID, it should work fine.
Yeah.
So you can get it from ETSR1.
Yes.
So the contract is going to be from ETSR1 to ETSR2 to the load. So you'll get that financial right, that piece.
Yeah, they will get the financial transfer revenue and then ETSR2 to load. They would not get the perfect hedge from the source to ETSR1.
Okay. And in order to, so I have to digest this information, see if this works. I think in the real situation, most likely you're not going to have the generator because, at the 9 o'clock, you may not have the full path of the tank. You may have some segment, you know that energy is going to be delivered to COP, but you may not know all the paths all the way that traces back to the generator. So at 9 o'clock, the chances of getting the generator is pretty low. So if you design this market, you need to have that assumption. So you may have the generator. I'm not saying that you will never get it, but there's a very high probability that you don't have that generator. If that has any financial consequences, like not having a perfect hedge, I don't know what that means. I need to think about it and go through all the numbers again. But that's you cannot assume that you're going to have the generator at 9 o'clock in order to make this work. Now, George, do you still want to go to the scheduling scenario, which I kind of interrupted, or we gone through that already? Sorry?
I did. Basically, the way you described your right is really across Malin and to the load. I didn't hear anything that will tell me that you have a transmission right from wherever this generator is to the border to Malin. So I don't consider this being part of the contract because I didn't hear anything from you saying so. It's just a contract for energy, but not for transmission. So your transmission contract is from ETSR1 to ETSR2 to the load, and you can schedule this. You can self-schedule those. And you will get the congestion revenue, the congestion cost from ETSR2 to the load, and the transfer revenue from ETSR1 to ETSR2. As I said, essentially you will be buying the load at the BAA1 marginal energy price. So that's the outcome. And that really goes along with what you described as a transmission contract. Yes, James.
Yeah, at some point, I know from a settlements perspective, I could make this work, but I'd like to hear from the EDAM entities on this concept as whether or not they think it will work for them as well. So at some point, I'd like to hear back from them.
Okay. So absolutely. I have some more questions. Now, James, in your example, you had that formula to take the lower off of the two sides, 2BA. But in this situation, WAPA has transmission rights, and there is no lower off. Would that work? Because any transmission revenue would go to WAPA only, would not be split with anybody else, because there is no lower off on both sides.
Right. That's just a mathematical. So in this situation for you, they're going to be exactly the same. ETSR1 and ETSR are providing the same transmission, so it's going to be the minimum of the two, which is essence, since they're the same, it's going to be the full rights. It's just that if they're, from a settlements perspective, we're creating a generic concept. So we would have a situation whenever you have ETSR1 and ETSR2, and they're providing different rights, I have to limit it to the lowest of the rights available. So in your situation, Tong, it would be equal to your rights because you're providing exactly the same on both sides.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I think to extend this to real scenario, it would be that the BAA1 is BPA and the BAA2 is a bank, because we have the right to will through the ISO BAA. I guess in that situation, there is no difference. It's just now BAA2 is not ISO, BAA2 is bank.
You probably have a more complicated example where there's another BAA and you have another transfer between ISO and bank, and you string them all together. So it works the same way.
It works the same way.
You'll still get the financial right on every piece of that chain.
Okay. All right. Now, I think I can move to the other question. Can we go to the page with MEC? The next one. Yeah, here, thanks.
Yep.
I don't quite understand what MEC is. Now, based on, George, what you said is marginal energy cost. Is marginal energy cost the energy component of LNP, or this is something different?
It is, Tong, and now I also said that it's more specifically the saddle price of the power balance constraint for that BAA. So that's the marginal energy cost. So essentially, we will use a system where the marginal energy cost, the marginal energy component of the LNP, will be potentially different for each BAA, and that would what is creating energy price differentials across BAA to be collected as transfer revenue.
Okay. So here, do you use like load distributed slack bus, reference bus, or how do you pick that reference bus? Because whatever MEC is, let's say MEC for BA1, that price is simply the price of the reference bus. It could be a single reference bus. It could be a distributed reference bus. So is this a bus that you just pick, or this is kind of a weighted average of all the load buses, or weighted average of all the gen buses?
It's the distributed load. We always use the distributed load as the reference for LNP calculations. So that's what we do in EAM as well.
Okay. So the $20 is simply the weighted average of all the load buses. And the BA2, the $30 is weighted average of all the load LNPs.
You can say it that way, yes.
Okay. Okay. So that that could be the value of the transmission, or it may or may not be. Conceptually, it could say it's the value of the transmission, but it's not mathematically really is.
You mean from 20 to 30?
Yeah.
You mean across the BAs from 20 to 30? Yeah. That is the value of transmission.
20 to 30.
Yeah, that's the value of transmission. It's essentially when this transmission is at its limit, at the scheduling limit. It's a bucket one, right? So whenever it hits the limit, in this case it is at limit, you can see that if you relax it by 1 megawatt, okay, you will be able to transfer 1 megawatt more, realizing another $10 savings, and that's your saddle price for that. So this is your transfer revenue. $10 is the value of the transmission. You're right.
Okay. From
we have other people in the queue. Can we go ahead and move on?
Okay. Yes. Go ahead. Thank you very much, George. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you. Operator, can you open the line for Kathleen Colbert?
Great, thank you. I will be very brief. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just had a mechanics question for James. This goes back pretty far. I apologize. And if you want to take this offline, James, we can. I just wanted to add to the scenario here. I was just thinking through for the ETSR self-schedules, what if there are two different scheduling coordinators for BA1 versus, so for the ETSR1 versus the ETSR2, and then also assuming that your vision is that each individual contract or reservation would separately need to be, let's say, submitted, that if there were more than one contract or CRN number making up this scenario, and just to be simple, I was thinking two, let's say one for 50 megs and a second one for 50 megawatts, two different FCs. Am I understanding this correctly, that would translate into 4 ETSR self-schedules and ETSR1 for the CRN1
ETSR1 for CRN2, et cetera, et cetera. Am I following this?
If you're going to have the pairs, ETSR1 and ETSR2 created, the CRN has to be the same across that contract path. So if we are going to have it going from a generator to ETSR1 and ETSR2 to load, that whole path is one contract reference number.
And if they had another contract reference number between the two of these entities, we would then have ETSR3 and ETSR4?
Yes, and then at that point, you could have multiple ETSRs with contract reference numbers, yes. But they are in pairs,
okay.
Yes.
And then backing that up to the gen and the load, would it be feasible for the gen to submit a single self-schedule for the 100 megawatts and the load to submit a single self-schedule for the 100? Just trying to figure out how complex this might get.
They would have to distribute that self-schedule to the specific CRNs that they're supporting.
Great, that's helpful. And I was also trying to figure out on the transfer revenue allocation, in that scenario that there's basically 4 50-megawatt parts, am I recalling the proposal correctly? Is the transfer of revenue would be allocated kind of on the share, so 50, each one of those parts would get 50 out of 100 allocated to it?
Yeah, let's just stick with the two ETSRs. Let's stick with ETSR1, ETSR2. There's different scheduling coordinators that are self-scheduling that CRN.
Yep.
Then that transfer revenue would be split between those two scheduling coordinators 50-50.
And if there's more than one, okay, I think I'm following you. So because you've separated out the ETSRs and that in ETSR3 and ETSR4, I assume the LNPs are the same in this scenario. You just created a functionality where you've like pre-separated that transmission amount out by megawatts?
Correct.
Got it. Thank you, Jay. Appreciate it.
That way we can explicitly determine the balance schedule and whether or not they should be eligible for the perfect hedge.
Okay, great. Operator, can you open up the line for Spires, please?
Good morning, it's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Can we go back to the diagram, please? So I appreciate George and the team at CAISO putting this together. I think it's helpful to understand more about the proposal. One question, George, was I think I have at least a high-level understanding of the financial settlements as you've been explaining them, but I'm still not sure that I fully understand the physical element here and what it means for the transmission path to be higher priority from an optimization point of view. And maybe more specifically, what I'm trying to understand is, under this example, how does the high priority of the transfer from BA1 to BA2 tie back to ensuring that the generator in BA1 is meeting the load in BA2? What is the connection by submitting that schedule with the generator, the transmission, and the load that assigns the high priority to that resource meeting that load?
George, you're on double mute.
Yes, of course I am. Thank you, Debbie. Okay, so yes, Jeff, there is no explicit connection between the generator and ETSR1 or the ETSR2 and the load, but it doesn't matter because the high priority self-schedules on all these resources are guaranteed that they're going to clear the market. So from an accounting perspective, of course, we don't know where the electrons go, but from an accounting perspective, we'll have the generator scheduled at 100 megawatts. the load schedule 100 megawatts, and there was going to be 100 megawatt transfer scheduled between the BAA. So again, from an accounting perspective, you can say that the generator serves that load. And for the financial right, we're using the contract reference number to tie the pieces to make sure the settlement leaves them neutral overall. Does that answer your question?
It does, although maybe what I'll just give you some feedback that I think what a concern is likely to be of that is setting aside the financial consequences. If an entity is submitting a schedule trying to bring in an external resource to meet their load on firm transmission that they've arranged for, I think the expectation they have is that that priority affords them with the confidence that that resource will be used to meet their load. And so I could think of a more realistic example building off of this one where there are other transfers that go from across this same interface. So you have other schedules in effect that are going from BA1 to BA2, but they may be scheduled to meet a different load, or they could even be traversing across BA2 and ultimately delivering to some other BA. And so when you get into a situation in which this transfer path is constrained and there's the possibility that not all of those schedules can flow, I think it matters which resource ends up meeting which load or which delivery ends up going where. And I think so just from a physical perspective, sorting through how an entity can rely on its transmission service for their own needs is something that is important.
Yeah, there could be multiple transfers, but the ones that are self-scheduled, they're not optimized. These are going to flow. We assume that there is sufficient transfer capability here between those BAAs to accommodate those contractual self-schedules that will be on these specific transfers. So let's say that you have 1,000 megawatts of transfer capability between BA1 and BA2, and you have two contracts, each for 100 megawatts. So we'll set up two bucket one transfers, each for 100 megawatts, and the rest of the 800 megawatts is released as bucket two. That 800 megawatts bucket two transfer is going to be optimized in the market, but those 200 megawatt each bucket one self-scheduled transfers, they're going to flow. There is room for it, so they're going to flow. They're going to be scheduled. There is no question about it. So you can say that the generator that's using that bucket one transfer and the load that's using that transfer, that generator serves that load. There's no question about that.
Well, I think that we know that there are critical periods of time in which transmission is constrained, system conditions are tight, and that there are cases when not all schedules can be accommodated. And I think that's where some of these issues around self-schedules and penalty prices to assign which schedules get curtailed becomes a really important issue. And we've obviously seen those issues in the past, and particularly when you're talking about flows between BAs, it can have a significant impact on the outcome. So, again, I think, these examples, I think, become more complicated when there are more than two BAs and you have entities that are securing transmission service to try to bring resources to their load, potentially wheeling across other BAs. And how do you sort that out from a physical flow perspective?
Okay, let's work through an example that I started relaying to Tom earlier. So let's go to the previous example. Let's say we only have one transfer of 100 megawatts and 900 megawatts are released as bucket two. All right, and let's say that we have an outage because the tight conditions doesn't matter unless they really affect the transfer capability. So let's say we have an outage that the transfer capability from normally 1,000 megawatts, it drops down to 50 megawatts, okay? Obviously, nothing can be optimized on that transfer, and even the 100 megawatt ride has to be cut to 50 megawatts. So The EDAM BAA that submits the scheduling limit for the bucket 1 transfer by 9 a.m., it will submit a scheduling limit of only 50 megawatts because that's all that we can flow. And obviously, with that 50 megawatts scheduling limit, that contract, the 100 megawatt contract between the generator and the load, can only be exercised for 50 megawatts. It cannot be exercised for more. So the self-schedules that the generator, the load, and the ETSRs would submit, they would be limited to 50 megawatts. We validate them that they're balanced. So we won't allow anything more than 50 megawatts because it will exceed the entitlement, will fail validation. So in this case, only 50 megawatts of the generator, you can say that it serves 50 megawatts of load because the contract is limited by the physical transfer capability. But it will be the first one to go through because it's a high scheduling priority. So, I mean, that should be clear, Jeff.
I don't think, well, first of all, I don't want to take up the whole call because I know there are others, but I think what I'm getting at is a little bit more nuanced than that, which is of that 50 megawatts, it could be that 25 of that megawatt of that transfer is sinking in the adjacent BA, but the other 25 is actually wheeling on other transmission reservations to a third BA, essentially wheeling across BA2 and going elsewhere. And so at that point, you don't have a mechanism for that entity that is wheeling across BA2 to be able to be confident that the resource it contracted for will be delivered to their load. I'm not, because there's no connection between the transfer and the resource and the load that it's ultimately meeting. That's what I'm trying to get at.
There is through the CRN. It's the example that Tonk said that you have 3 BAAs. You have BPA, ISO, and bank, and the contract wills through ISO. So all these pieces could be lined up. So in your case, you have now 2 contracts, one for 25 megawatts, going from BA1 to BA2, some generator in BA1 to some load in BA2, and another 25 megawatts going from a generator in BA1 to BA2, and then through another bucket 1 transfer to BA3 to a load in BA3. These are all high priority self-schedules, and if the transmission capacity is at least 100 megawatts on between BA1 and BA2, and at least 25 megawatts between BA2 and BA3, they will all flow.
So in that, and this will be my last question, in that situation, if there is a constraint on the import from BA1 to BA2, and that schedule needs to be curtailed by 5 megawatts, does the export from BA2 to BA3 that's on that same contract reference schedule also get curtailed?
Well, no. Hold on a second. If there is a 5 megawatt that this contract from BA1 to BA2 cannot be accommodated, then the scheduling limit as part of the bucket 1 transfer declaration for that contract is going to be only 95 megawatts, and then the contract can be exercised only for 95 megawatts. So through and through from that generator to the load, wherever it's going through, I don't know how many BAAs, you will have a string of 95 megawatts. So it's not that we're going to cut it, it's that when it's represented in the market by self-schedules, it won't be represented more than 95 megawatts, which is the entitlement on the path from ETSR1 to ETSR2. We validate for that.
Right. I mean, I guess my questions were really addressed at what the high priority means from a penalty price point of view. So I'm kind of assuming that now we're in real time, you have these schedules, system conditions have changed, and a curtailment is necessary. And you've got some contracts that are traversing multiple BAs and multiple TSPs, and they're not connected. So it's not clear to me how the order of curtailments it would be implemented in a way that resources that are scheduled to specific loads would be honored based on their transmission priority, but maybe this is something we just need to come back to.
Yeah,
CRN. Okay.
Yeah, because now we're talking about real time. So here, these examples were only for the day-ahead market. What happens in real time is probably a different question, but again, the same principle applies. Self-schedules under a contract reference number, they have a higher scheduling priority, so they're accommodated first, and everything else around them is redispatched in real time to accommodate them. So to the extent that they can be accommodated, you could still have your generator serve the load under the contract. Debbie?
Let's go ahead and move on. I'd like to get all the examples in today. So operator, if you could go to slide 16. The other question that we got was what happens for internal contracts that are serving load, and how does the contract reference number work? So with that, James, I'll let you lead us through this discussion, and then we'll go back and ask questions.
Okay. Yeah, so what I tried to do is set up a scenario that was very similar to what George had started with, but I narrowed it down to a single BAA where I had 2 generators that are supporting a load, and they have a contract reference number to support that load. Now, the entitlement is 100 megawatts entitlement, but the capacity of generator 1 and generator 2 varies. Generator 1 can supply 100 megawatts, so they could support the entire CRN, or you could do it in some type of combination with generator 2, who has the ability to provide 50 megawatts of generation to support load. The sink, as the transmission capacity is 100 megawatts, so the entitlement is going to be 100 megawatts. As George referenced in the other slides, it's going to be registered in MasterFile or declared in cyber by the transmission customers by 9 a.m. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to go through this real quick because we are short on time. So in this C1, and I'm going to make an assumption that the scheduling coordinators are all separate scheduling coordinators. They have contracts that allow them to do this, but they could all be the same scheduling coordinator. But just for simplification purposes, I'm going to assume they're all different scheduling coordinators. So scheduling coordinator 1 will self-schedule, in this scenario, generator 1 for 75 megawatts of its 100 megawatt capability. It has the ability to self-schedule the additional 25 megawatts or bid in the capacity that's not tied to the CRN. Schedule coordinator 2 will self-schedule generator 2 for 25 megawatts under the CRN. And again, like generator 1, it has the ability to self-schedule or bid in the additional capacity into the market for use to serve other loads. And then scheduler 3 will self-schedule the load for 100 megawatts under the CRN. Same as above. And then, so we go to the next slide. So in this, the schedules are balanced. The self-schedules from generator 1 and generator 2 add up to 100 megawatts, which is serving the 100 megawatts of load under the CRN. They're going to clear the IFM with a high scheduling priority. The LMP within BAA1, or in this BAA, is the marginal energy cost is $20. Generator 1's LMP is going to be $15 per megawatt, which means there's going to be $5 of congestion associated with generator 1. Generator 2 is also going to have $5 congestion. It's going to have a price of $15 per megawatt. And load is going to be priced at $25, which means it's going to be paying an additional $5 to have its load served. In our settlement, SCE1 is going to be paid $1,125 for generator 1's 75 megawatt output. In that, we are collecting $375 of congestion for that BAA. SCE2 is paid $375 for the 25 megawatts of output from generator 2, and we're collecting $125 of congestion. SCE3, which is going to be the load, is going to be charged $2,500 for the 100 megawatts of load consumption. With the $5 of congestion cost, it's going to collect $500 of congestion. The SCs in aggregate receive the financial rights under the CRN. George broke it down a little more eloquently than I did. But in essence, the CRN will receive the perfect hedge for $1,000. $375 will be the perfect hedge for generator 1. They'll get paid back that $375 and reduce the day ahead congestion offset or congestion rents by $375. Generator 2 will get paid back $125 and reducing the congestion rents by $125. And then load would also get paid back the $500, reducing the congestion rents for $500. So by this, the SCEs are neutral and the BAA itself is neutral. And now I'm going to open this up for questions. I'm assuming we answered a lot of the questions in the previous discussion because it was a lot more complicated, but I wanted to show what an internal BAA contract might look like when you have more than one generator serving a load.
Boccignani, did you want to get back in the queue? And you can ask questions about either scenario. Operator, could you open up Doug's line?
It's Doug Boccignani for BAMX. Yeah, my question was about the previous example, the previous discussion.
It's okay. We can go back to that.
So I'm thinking about the interactions with the congestion revenue rights within CAISO. So those rights are sort of using CAISO transmission, both internal to CAISO and from each of the interties to the loads. And so it seems like with respect to the intertie transmission, it's, the exact same transmission that's, I think, envisioned could be used for some of these ETSRs. So it seems like there's going to be an impact on the CRRs, or that there may need to be changes to how the CRRs are settled to reflect that transactions that previously might have been occurring at the interties are going to potentially now occur through these transfers. And, I think we haven't really discussed in this process how that's going to work, or what are the options and what needs to be considered. I'm just wondering what's going to be the process for addressing that kind of question.
Milos, did you want to respond to that? And you're double muted.
Sure. Good morning. This is Milos from the California ISO. Thanks for the question, Doug. I think we'll need to, I don't envision that we'll have time necessarily to get into it in the working group, so we'll need to the extent that there are any implications on the CRR front for the ISO, I think we would need to note it in the straw proposal, or at least shed some light on it in the straw proposal.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, just kind of the things that immediately jump out at me is for the CRRs from the interties today, there's value that's derived from those CRRs hitting the scheduling limit. There's value that's associated with sort of the downstream flows on the CAISO grid. And it's this, these ETSR transfer volumes, are going to essentially displace some intertie transactions that otherwise would have occurred. And today, the only way that parties get the congestion hedge via the CRRs. Here, and I think George even referenced in one of his responses to one of Tom's questions, he talked about, this ETSR potentially would confer protection all the way down to the load. So it seems like there's definitely an overlap with what's happening, at least within CAISO, with CRRs today.
Yeah, and thanks. Yeah, and thanks, Doug. And maybe I'll I think we had some of this discussion during James's walking through some of the congestion revenue and the transfer revenue allocation process and how that would be allocated, at the enterprise with the ISO. And I don't know, James, if you want to note anything further on that, but I think I think you addressed some of this during that part of the discussion. So I don't know, James, if you want to elaborate on that.
So when we talked about it in the examples where we do the examples 1, 2, and 3, we talked about landing in a position where the transfer revenue is going to be allocated to the EDAM BAA that is providing that transmission to get to the ISO. And then once it gets to the ISO, the ITC constraint takes over. And that ITC congestion would stay within the ISO and would support CRRs. So I don't foresee, there might be some modifications needed, but for the most part, I believe that by maintaining the ITC in the ISO balancing authority area, we are covering the CRRs. George, you have anything to add?
Yes, just to clarify that the transmission capacity that is released for CRRs does not include encumbered transmission in contracts. So obviously, you have a contract and you can exercise your contract and essentially you get your financial right. So the CRR is the flip side of the coin where you don't have a contract, but you have a CRR and it gives you a similar financial right. So those two cannot overlap. So in the CRR nomination and auction, the transmission capacity that is released for CRRs does not include transmission capacity that's encumbered with transmission contracts. That's taken off the top. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, George, that clarification. So what we've been discussing about in the earlier examples would be contracted transmission, but the bulk of the rights, the bulk of the transmission within CAISO isn't so encumbered, right? It's available for the market to use, but presumably and I think what you've been saying is, well, if people show up with resource sufficiency resources, you're going to associate those rights or those contracts with the bucket 1. So I was inferring from that CAISO was essentially going to be converting some of the transmission that currently is used for intertype transactions and associated with CRRs is going to be making that available for EDAM transfers. And maybe I'm not, that inference maybe is incorrect, but I would like to know if I'm mistaken. And then I just want to go to respond to something James said about the ETSR values. I mean, I think it's still an open question. I hope it's still an open question about which of the options, A, B, or C, is appropriate for the allocation of the transfer revenue, because I think there's potentially some big problems with the option C. I don't think we've really fully resolved that.
Agreed. It's still open discussion. It was just I was just trying to highlight that is where the congestion in order to fund the CRRs is being funded from. So there may be some elements to it that may have to be modified depending upon which of the options we land on. But it is coming from the ITC congestion.
Yeah, and I guess the point I was trying to make earlier is I think there is an interaction between the ITC congestion and the ETSR congestion or value. And I don't think I don't think you can just assume away that interaction, and because otherwise you're going to essentially transfer value that currently is realized through the ITC. I expect a big part of that value is now going to happen through ETSRs, and that's why I have some concerns about just with this option C concept.
Okay, so we'll note that and consider how to look at that further.
Okay,
Back
great.
specific on your question on whether intertie capacity will be converted from the current capacity that's available for imports at ISO scheduling points to transfers with EDAM BAAs. As we mentioned earlier, if a scheduling point in a BAA outside the ISO now becomes within the market scheduling point as part of that BAA joining EDAM, essentially the scheduling point will be converted to a transfer between the ISO and that EDAM BAA. But we did say that if a participant or another BAA has rights through that EDAM BAA to get the border, we can still support participation at the ISO scheduling points with import, and this is the only case where we have intertie bids with the ISO. So in that case, obviously the transmission capacity for that, which represents the right of that participant, let's say going through BPA, for example, to bid at Malin, now we have a transfer with BPA at Malin and potentially an import bid at Malin for that participant that is using it their own rights. They are both constrained by the Malin scheduling limit, the ISL we call. It's either an ISL or an ITC. In this case, it's an ISL. And the congestion revenue is collected on the ISL if it's binding. They stay with the ISO to fund TRRs at Malin's source. So that's, I hope this provides an answer to your question.
But in terms of, you said a bid at the intertie, but to exercise the rights within the EDAM, you have to self-schedule. So it's a particular kind of bid.
Oh, well, again, I'm going to refer you back to that slide that gave you the options of what to do with the rights. You have the option to exercise the right if you want to get a scheduling priority for it and the financial right, or you also have the option to simply release the transmission capacity for anyone to use, and you can bid on it, in which case you could be scheduled if the price is right, or somebody else could be scheduled to use it, and you collect the any congestion revenue on so it depends. It depends how you want to use your rights. So we did lay out some options for that.
Okay. Operator, can you open the line for Stuart Kelly?
Thank you, Deb. Yeah, I just wanted to, second that point by Doug that, the allocation of transfer revenue is very much an open question, and the notion that the ITC constraint takes over and the revenue stays within the ISO is kind of TBD. So I just wanted to reinforce that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, operator. Can you open up the line for Perry?
Hey, Perry again. Just wanted to echo that Doug brought up a good point there, and I think if I have this CRN, I should also expect to get the ITC congestion settled directly from the CAISO as well. So that does impact, I think, what you guys are planning to do with splitting the ETSR and the ITC congestion, how you're going to allocate that out. The other point, just to think about maybe for homework, I guess, is that, you're telling me that I'll get settled the ETSR congestion directly from CAISO. How you might be carving that out from the ETSR congestion that you're going to split 50-50 among the BAAs that are not associated with me and my CRM. I don't need an answer now. I know it's the end of the call. Just think about that. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And we do have, a whole deck still to go through. So we'll start up on Thursday talking about the transmission buckets. And both of those issues as far as the ETSR and the revenue allocation are still coming up in future slides. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, for today's participation. We greatly appreciate your insights and perspectives in helping us to come up with a straw proposal that is much more informed than one that the ISO could put out on their own. So with that, operator, if you could go ahead and end the call, I'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks so much, everybody.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.